Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 257, Music is My Language, with Ananya Venkateswaran. Ananya has made music in many places around the world, and she believes that choir is everywhere. Choir is in all the places. We get into discussion later in the episode about how choir might look and sound and feel differently everywhere, but choir is everywhere and for everyone. So this week I am discussing music with a unique guest for this show. Ananya is a 17-year-old choral high school student in Dubai, UAE. She's a longtime listener of this show, and she shares her unique experiences as a, quote, third culture kid, and her journey in music. You're going to be so impressed by how well-spoken and intelligent and really beyond her years this discussion is. You're going to learn a lot, and she's just a kid. From her roots in Carnatic music to her passion for Western choral traditions, Ananya discusses the importance of cultural identity in music, her education in an international school, and her leadership experiences in choral settings. She reflects on her participation in the European Choir Games recently, where her trio represented the UAE, and emphasizes the interdisciplinary connections between music, language, and the arts. Ananya's insights reveal a deep understanding of music's role in bridging cultures and in fostering community, as well as fostering connections for students between their music and also their other academic subjects. So tune in, weigh in over on the Facebook page called Choralosophers, where we can discuss things that happen in these episodes. You can also ask your unrelated questions, if it's long as it's related to choral music, music education, the arts, philosophy, etc. over there. You can also subscribe for free at choralosophy.substack.com for our blog wing of the Choralosophy brand, so check out some of the exciting things that are happening there as well. Choir directors, music educators, show planners, you pour your heart into your music. Shouldn't your events get the same attention? That's where Ludus comes in. Sell tickets, promote your concerts, and fundraise with ease. Selling merchandise and concessions? Ludus Retail makes in-person sales effortless. Running choir camps or workshops? They have a classes feature that keeps registration simple, and when you need help, the live support team is ready to pop up with real answers from real people. The best part? It's completely free for organizations. Thousands of music programs already trust Ludus because great music deserves more than just a ticketing system. I don't know if you've heard about it. If you haven't heard about it, you've got to go try 3-Minute Theory. You can go to 3minutetheory.com and you can check it out now when you decide to get this comprehensive system of pre-made materials for your music theory related concepts. You just go into that account and pull out tons of ready-made material. I don't think you'll be even able to teach all of it in 1 year. It's so much stuff that you can tailor make and custom make to your needs. So go check it out, and of course use the Choralosophy discount code when you sign up to get a 15% discount on your membership. I'm not sure how much, if anything, out there has not gone up in price since 2020, but I know one thing that hasn't, and that is the membership to the Patreon and to the Substack to support this show. The people who are signed up over there as paid subscribers, as my thank you to them, they can get things like t-shirts from the choralosophy.com shop. They can also get access to my Google folder of teaching materials that I've talked about on the show for over the years. And of course, they just want to help make sure that this show can continue. And one of those benefits is a shout out on the show. Shout outs for the Inner Circle and producer tiers over on Patreon. We have Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Heron, Rebecca Chalk, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. All right, everyone. I'm here with Ananya Venkateswaran, and we are going to be talking about a variety of things related to the way that our culture interacts with our love of music and our love of choral music in particular. And I'm excited to welcome Ananya because she is the youngest guest that I've ever had on the show, unless you include like a high school choir, right? Which I have had entire high school choirs on the show before. But this is going to be fun because like we were just discussing as we were getting ready, This represents kind of a way that this show and its conversations about choral music can kind of reach the next generation. So Ananya, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Start out by telling us just a little bit about you. Who are you? Where do you come from? What do you do every day?
Awesome. Yeah. So I am a third culture kid through and through. When people ask me where I'm from, this is the question that I kind of struggle to answer. But the easiest short answer is that I'm Indian in origin. I have roots in India. I grew up in the US. The US is home, so Tampa, Florida. But I've spent the past 13 years living in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And so that has very much come to be home for me.
So why all those places? If you don't mind
Yeah,
sharing,
not at all.
why the roots and then why Florida and then why
Yeah.
UAE?
So I'm a third generation American. I had grandparents emigrate to the US back last century, so back in the 60s and 70s. And so the US very quickly became home. I was born in Tampa and grew up there for only about 5 years, but Florida became that first home for me. And then we moved to Abu Dhabi 13 years ago for my dad's work and kind of wondered what it would be like. And my family ended up loving it. And so it has very quickly become just this place that has felt like home. I've met so many amazing, amazing people, and it's just been this incredible experience to get to live in Abu Dhabi.
That's amazing. Travel. One of the things that I feel for my children. I have children just a bit younger than you, but that if the more I can get them to travel, even the more I can broaden their perspective about how humans are. Because if we
Absolutely.
never leave the humans around us, we tend to think that they're all just like us. And I imagine that you've at a young age have already kind of discovered that that's not true. People behave differently everywhere.
100%. And it's been such a blessing to grow up in a place that's at this crossroads of so many different people's lives and experiences. And I mean, going to school with people from all over the globe and that just being normal is this huge gift.
Yeah. What about your love and nerdery for choral music? Where did that come from?
You know what? That's a hard question to answer. And so for me, my first roots as a musician are rooted in Carnatic classical music of South India. And I went to a concert at 4 or 5 years old. I decided I loved it and had my parents put me in vocal lessons. And so that has been my, I guess my basis in music as a Carnatic vocal musician. And that is very much an ensemble tradition. I've grown up learning how to sing, but it's learning how to sing with other people. And so though that doesn't necessarily look like this Western art music choral experience, it very much is ensemble led music making. And so that's where my love, I think, for making music with other people comes from. But then it was, in elementary, middle school, singing with choirs in school. And very quickly, I just fell in love with this mode of the Western art classical music tradition of choral music making and getting to do this thing with other people and figuring out, okay, I can hold down a harmony. And very quickly that turned into something that I knew I loved. I auditioned for my school's chamber choir as a freshman. I got in and I kind of haven't looked back since. It's been just a huge part of my life and it's become more and more a thing where I not only love getting to sing in choirs, but getting to be on the other side of writing music for choirs and getting to conduct choirs of my own. And so it's just very quickly become a thing that I've realized I love doing. It connects all of these pieces of the world I love, getting to connect with people, getting to make beautiful music, getting to delve into all of this amazing repertoire that just tells us so much about the world around us. So it's kind of been a culmination of all of these things that I love.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that, of course, I was so impressed with when you started communicating with me a while back, as you listened to this show, is just you do seem to be very kind of wise beyond your years related to the way you communicate about music, which I find very impressive. Would you be willing to share with us just how young you are?
Absolutely. So I'm 17 years old. I'm going into
Okay.
my senior year of high school in a week and a half.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Now, am I correct in remembering that all of your high school has been in UAE?
Yes, that's right. So I've done pretty much all of my formal school past kindergarten in the UAE. Bounced around a couple of schools, but I've spent most of my career as a student at the American Community School there in Abu Dhabi. So it's very much like going to an American school. It just happens to be really international and in the middle of Abu Dhabi.
Right. That's interesting. That was going to be my next question. Is it like an American school? And I've seen American schools in different places, and how would you describe to someone who doesn't really know what that is, especially if they're an American who didn't like ever think about that concept? how do they describe what an American school is to those folks there in Abu Dhabi?
Yeah, well, that's a hard question to answer just because no international American school is a monolith. But I would say in general, when you think about that American international experience, there are so many kids like me who are, lucky enough to have roots in the US and have grown up in the American culture, but then get to go and explore another country and live there. And so there's this whole circuit of these incredible American international schools where all the state standards, all the things we do are rooted in the US. And so I'm taking AP classes as a high schooler, doing all of those things that I would do if I lived in the US. It just happens to be in this incredible international community. And so I would say over half of my classmates and my peers in my community has roots in the US somehow or the other. And yet all of us have ended up being transplants in another host country, which is really cool. But we have our whole system internationally of the way we do things that kind of mimics what we would do if we had grown up in the US. So we have sports tournaments. We have international honor festivals that sort of mirror what it would be like to sing in an all-state choir or perform in an all-state band. And so it's very much similar, I think, to having grown up in the US in the systems we get to exist within, and yet we just get to do it so internationally. My idea of, a summer vacation is I get to go explore another country. I get to go on school trips with my friends doing service, not in the next state over, but in another country. And so it's been just absolutely incredible to grow up with such an international experience.
You mentioned that your first foray into singing and group singing was in the Carnatic tradition, Indian classical tradition. And honestly, I probably went the first 40 years of my life without knowing anything about that at all. And then I got to know Rena Esmail through this show.
Love her,
and started learning more about it just because I was inspired from her music. And now I would definitely not call myself an expert. And I know a lot of people listening probably don't know a whole lot about it either. But how would you describe that tradition of singing, especially if you were to think of it compared to the high school choir experience or the Western choir experience that you have at school? How are they alike and how are they different?
Yeah, so love Rena. She's a dear, dear mentor that I got to know through this show, among other things. And so Rena is trained in the Hindustani classical tradition. And so that's a classical art and music tradition of northern India. And then its sort of counterpart in southern India is Carnatic music, which is similar in lots of ways, but also very much a distinct music tradition of its own. And Carnatic music has roots just like music in liturgy and in that traditional religious avenue, but it is very much an evolved musical tradition of its own. And so when thinking about sort of the theory, but also the day-to-day practicality of what is similar and different, the way I kind of like to think about it is a Venn diagram, in that there's so much that is similar between the two traditions, that is Carnatic music and Western art music, but then there's so much that kind of binds them together as both being rooted in, you're singing in a specific key. A big thing is, you have tonality, you're trying to sing together in a specific key. You have the idea that both music traditions are rooted in that liturgy and it originally having a religious root. Both, I think, traditions are deeply focused on that precision, that whatever precision looks like, whether that's rhythmic or tonal or vowel blend, you're trying to create something together. And even if you're a solo musician, there's this precision required to perform at a high level. And they both have these really strong ensemble traditions. But then in terms of differences, I think the biggest one is the structure of tonality within the two systems. So in Western art music, you have fewer scales. So they're both born of these two parent scales, that is major or minor. And then you have all these variations and you have modes. Carnatic music is a whole other ballgame. So you have thousands of what they call Janya ragas or children ragas born of these 72 main ragas. And so raga is the scale, a raga or a ragam. And these are these main scales that so there's 72 of these original scales that are 7-tone scales, all in, I guess, different, what the Western world would call modes or permutations of them. And then you have these Jinya ragas, which are permutations of these 72 main scales. And you have all of these different variations then that come from that. So, for example, you have Shankarabaranam, which is the 29th Melakarta ragam, is the mirror ragam of what we would call the Western major scale. But then from that, you get all these permutations. You have Bilahari, which is the pentatonic major scale going up, but then that 7-tone major scale going down. You have all sorts of these different permutations for each of these scales. So there are thousands and thousands and thousands of ragams. And then each of these pieces that you would sing operate within one of these ragams. I think another big difference when we think rhythmically in terms of time signatures, in the Western art music world, you have these infinite time signatures, whereas in Carnatic music, you have 7 main thalams, which kind of refer to the idea of the timing of music. And so they are these hand beats that you do, and they kind of correspond to what I think of as a time signature. And you have 7 main thalams or timings. I think another big thing in the choral world is that it's mainly a written tradition. You know, you learn how to sight read. That music literacy piece is so important, and that notation is how music gets passed down. With Carnatic music, it's almost entirely oral. And so Carnatic music is where I have my basis, I think, in a lot of ear training. And you grow up learning how to learn by rote. It's that call and response, but also when there is notation, it's notation that is very much accompanied by that element of oral teaching and that call and response sort of rote learning. I would say in Carnatic music, you have very complex melody, but you have minimal counterpoint. Whereas in Western art music, there's that big focus on counterpoint and harmony. And so day to day, what that meant for me growing up is that my basis in Carnatic music taught me all of these incredible skills as a solo musician of, you know, I've got to be precise, learning those really, really intricate melodies, learning how to train my ear and have that really strong ability to sing completely orally and with that rote music basis, as compared to a Western art music tradition where it's, okay, I need to read this thing now and I need to be able to audiate. And I think that audiation happens in such a different way, where with Carnatic music, it's being able to hear something and then recall it. With Western art music, it's being able to see something on a page and then think that through and be able to hear that in your head and then sing it or play it. And then day to day too, I think with Carnatic music, there's that big focus on, you know, we're all singing this one thing together. And so everything needs to be perfect in terms of that rhythmic and tonal accuracy. With Western art music, it's things that we're singing might be, in my experience, a little bit simpler than Carnatic music, but all of a sudden we have counterpoint and harmony, and there's a conductor we're watching instead of just doing this thing together a little bit more intuitively.
Wow. That's a pretty, that's a dissertation there. I appreciate that explanation. It's very thorough. Now, of course, you've listened to the show quite a bit, so you probably won't be surprised by this response, but I hear you talk about those similarities and differences, and I'm thinking the whole time that those skills actually feed each other.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, like it's not, I think it gets framed a lot by people as there is this way to learn music, which is oral, and there is this way to learn music, which is visual. And Western people care about visual things, and other people don't care about visual things. They just care about oral things. And I just have always thought that's just such as an oversimplified explanation. The oral and the visual feed each other. And in my experience, people who come from oral traditions of music making, once I teach them how to read the Western notation, become very good at it because they have that ability to hear the musical language in their head, which makes reading so much better and so much easier. Just like a child who is raised in a high vocabulary environment oftentimes becomes able to read written language a whole lot better with a higher vocabulary because they hear it a whole lot better. So does that vibe with your experience?
Absolutely. And I would say it's been one of those things where getting to grow up at this crossroads of Western art music and Carnatic music has been one of those things that I think has often been presented to me as a hard thing of, but we do it differently in this tradition, so you better not do that here. We're distinct. And yet I think when I think of all my successes as a musician over the short musical career I've had so far, it's been rooted in that cross-cultural experience that I have, where I'm definitely a far better sight reader for being able to, having come into sight reading already able to audiate. And I only started to learn how to sight read when I was maybe 8 or 9, when I'd already been singing for 5 or 6 years. And at that point, I was able to already look at the page and I'm like, okay, I understand this. And after that initial hurdle of there is stuff on a page and it's supposed to mean music, all of a sudden being able to read for piano, which is how I first learned how to sight read, was very easy, but also having then those two twin experiences, being able to read for voice, which I think is harder just because you're having to audiate, all of a sudden that felt very doable. And so for me, my friends in choir will laugh at me because I'm like, yeah, I can hear it in my head. And I think being able to translate that written music into music that's audiatable, if that's a word, is very good. much doable because of that background. But then even with Carnatic music, because Carnatic music is an oral tradition, that's not to say that it's a tradition that doesn't have any notation. It does more and more. There is notation within that Carnatic music world. And you get, your Carnatic music primers that have sort of the versions of solfege written in with a little bit of rhythmic suggestion. And things like that, all of a sudden, I can kind of pick up and I'm like, oh, I can sight read this. And my teacher will sometimes look at me like I'm crazy. That is my Carnatic vocal teacher. And she'll be like, you're doing what? I'm like, I'm sight reading it. And she's like, okay. But it's definitely having skills in each of those worlds makes me a more proficient musician in the other, which has been really cool to have just because it's such a cool experience. And it's one of those that I think shared with other musicians who have similar experiences to me, there's just so much that you could think about that can grow and feed off of each other between having multiple traditions. And I think that's such a strength.
Right. Absolutely. Are you a director new to the profession, or are you a seasoned director who is in a new place? One of my favorite tips for generating interest in the program and to instill buy-in is to plan a trip. There are so many options. You can go to Orlando, you can go to Ireland, or you can perform in a parade or a theme park. You can even take the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York. Wherever you end up, not only will your current crew look forward to the trip, but younger students will count the days until it's their turn to go. If you have no idea where to start, connect with Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I'm glad you pointed that out about how people do sometimes misunderstand that oral tradition as having no notation at all, which of course is not true. The need to write things down is not a Western invention. And I think it drives me absolutely crazy when people frame it as if it is, because you're kind of being Eurocentric while criticizing Eurocentric people when you say that writing things down, because there are written traditions that are thousands of years older than European colonization. So that's just silly. But yeah, so I'm glad you pointed that out. And what I'm curious too about is because you're well versed even at a young age in these two styles. One thing I think about a lot, partly because it's my own gap in knowledge, but is that with Western notation or stick notation or whatever people call it, if I were to try to write down a piece that is Carnatic, what would be the limitations? What would be is it mostly the microtonality that would just not really fit on a staff? How would you describe why it would be tricky to write a Carnatic piece down in stick notation?
You are talking my language now. So this is what I've found is sort of a little passion project for me, is looking at, I want to arrange this Carnatic piece for a Western choir. How do I do this? And all of the things you just mentioned, those microtones are a big thing of how do I put something that I've learned orally into staff notation? And this is actually a conversation I've had multiple times with Rena Esmail of, she and I are kind of working on this in different ways. Obviously, she has years and years of experience, and she's done a lot of this with Hindustani music, but I find myself doing a lot on the other side of the pond with Carnatic music. And one of the big things I think is hard is just, it's almost like notating jazz. In that with jazz, when you learn jazz intuitively, it's that you know that there are all these things you need to do. There's sort of that jazz standard, but there's also all of this improvisation that kind of just happens. And you have lots of room for flex, even though you're in a pretty rigid structure. And I think that's a thing I see a lot with Carnatic music, where so one of the big things is you need to get back on the beat by the first beat of the next thalum, which is almost like saying I need to be right back on the beat, first beat of the next measure. But also what do I do with between then? And I think a hard thing for me in figuring out how to do some of that notation has also been figuring out I don't want to oversubscribe my musicians. I don't want to be so overly notated that a piece loses its authenticity. And yet at the same time, there's this need for telling a musician, this is how you do it. And so I think a big piece of what makes notating Carnatic music hard is because so much of the time notation implies that a musician can do this on their own. And Carnatic music, I think even notated, has this aspect of you need to have grown up in that oral tradition. You need to have a teacher telling you this is the way you do it. You need to train that intuition of saying this sounds right and this feels right. And I can explain using the theory why, but I think before that there needs to be the sense of feeling I understand that this is how this is supposed to happen. And so a big thing for me that I think about in terms of that notation is just finding ways to make room for that intuition, but also successfully guide musicians who maybe don't have a background in Carnatic music. And then, yeah, it absolutely is things like those microtones where Carnatic music uses something that's closer to a just temperament system rather than an equal temperament. And more, I think, with cross-cultural connection. And with musical globalization, we see some of that shifting, and we see sometimes shifts within the Carnatic world to something that feels closer to a 12-tone equal temperament system. And yet there are those gray areas. And there are times where I'm like, no, I want you just slightly sharper, but I don't want you a half step sharper. And so there's 100% room where it's hard to explain what you want to do when you have the limitations of a staff and a page. And yet I think there's so much room for collaboration there, that there's so much that can be done. You can pick ragams or scales where maybe those microtones aren't as visible. You can pick thalams or time signatures where maybe there's less of that flex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good. And I wonder too, I've had arguments even in rehearsals with Western trained musicians, professional adults, about how there aren't different versions of an E. I'm like, yeah, there are actually. There are almost infinite numbers of versions. Does it sound in tune or does it not? And of course, in that just intonation, that's an interesting connection too, because in the history, if you go back far enough in Western choral music, that just intonation is actually very much part of the tradition, and then we kind of lost it and got that what is now we think of as the Western well-tempered 12-tone, and there's only one E and there's only one F natural and all that kind of stuff. That's actually relatively new. Mm-hmm. And so that connection, that's why I really strongly advocate choirs rehearse a cappella, because then we actually have access to that infinite spectrum of frequencies, which could then make their ears a little bit more awake to doing music from other cultures that don't use the 12 tones. So I think that's where some of these skills really feed each other, which I think is awesome and can be very cool. Now, I do have another kind of little question here for you to think through, which is that when we think about these music making across different cultures, and we think about group music making, and if we're talking about singers, I'm curious to your thoughts from your perspective on what it means to sing in a choir, because for a lot of people, that is a Western thing. But where you occupy these kind of cross sections of different cultural identities, you have group singing experience in your background and in your training that isn't just what a Western person would think of as a choir. So are we kind of sniffing onto a more broad, expansive definition of what a choir is? Couldn't it just be a group of people that are singing together? Thoughts about that?
Yeah, so this is a thing actually that I think through a lot, just because my basis in Carnatic music is, so right now I've been with the same teacher all 12 or 13 years that I've been singing. She's this incredible, incredible woman. And so for the past 5 or 6 years, I've just been the only student in her studio doing what I'm doing and doing what I'm doing at a level consistently that requires having her as my teacher. And so I've been, her solo voice student, and that's a lot like taking voice lessons. But for my first 4 or 5 formative years singing Carnatic music, it was in a room of 5 or 6 other kids, and it was all of us learning the same thing and calling and responding and singing together. And for the longest time, I didn't see that as a choir, because by the time I was in 6th or 7th grade and singing with a Western art music choir, it was, to sing in a choir, you need to all be singing, this piece of music that's written and notated using staff notation, and you need to be singing harmonies, and there needs to be counterpoint, and there needs to be dynamics. And that's not what I grew up with. And yet more and more, I think my perspective on this is just people making music together. And I think in my head, a choir is a group of people who are coming together and singing. And so more and more what I'm very conscious to use in my vocabulary is differentiating that when I say choir, I don't just necessarily mean a Western art music choir. And therefore, when I'm thinking about a choir in the Western sense, I'm very careful to use the terminology Western art music choir, because that's what it is. And I think it's incredibly limiting to almost be snobby about this vocabulary and say that a choir is a choir only if it's a choir in the eyes of the Western world. And so I think choirs exist everywhere. I mean, there are folk music traditions across the globe. And to limit a choir to being what we see a choir as being in that very stereotypical way is to limit that form of expression. And so I think it's really important to differentiate that, yes, there are choirs everywhere. And yes, this is what a typical Western art music choir might look like. But if I'm singing Carnatic music with a group of other people, there's a term that needs to be usable there, because it's more specific than just an ensemble. We're a group of people making music together vocally. We're a choir.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful, and I completely agree. I think that's really what it has to be, or else we're not really exploring the art form. We're exploring just a version of it, or a cross section, or a tiny little sliver of the Venn diagram, so to speak, to use your reference from before. Yeah, that's really good. And I also think that choirs or choral music, and now I'm using that term in the broad, extensive way that we just talked about, is also an interdisciplinary thing, meaning in the Western art tradition, of course, poetry is a big part of it. Literature references are a big part of it. You mentioned in the Carnatic tradition and earlier in the Western tradition as well, religious texts, religious observances are, of course, a huge part of it. So it's even difficult to say, what is a choir and why do they sing? Because that answer is also extremely different everywhere. So talk to us a little bit about how you think of that interdisciplinary aspect. I'm assuming, just by hearing you talk at age 17, that you are a reader. You are interested in other things other than just music, or else you wouldn't be so sharp. So how does that fit into your broader interests?
Sure, yeah. So more and more, I think what I'm an advocate of is this fact that a big thing we can leverage as choral musicians and creators of choral music is that interdisciplinary background that many of us have. And especially, I mean, thinking about my experience in choir, I am very much a choral musician. I throw myself headfirst into it, but I'm not a professional. What I am is I'm a high school student who really loves doing this stuff. But what that means too is that I have this incredible breadth of knowledge just because I'm a high school student who has to take general education requirements. And what that means is that every person I'm sitting in choir with has a background in math and the social sciences and English. And I think that's just such an incredible background to be able to bring to choir. And in my experience, I think that background in, especially rooted in the humanities, just influences so much of what I do, both as a choral singer, but also especially as a choral conductor and a choral creator and arranger and composer. And so for me, that's especially rooted in two disciplines, so writing and then the social sciences. And I'm a published poet and essayist, and for me, that idea of expressing myself through words has long been a thing that I've really enjoyed, as well as then the social sciences, and more things like governance and policy are areas that really, really interest me. But what I found is all of those practices seem to sort of bolster each other. And a big thing that I think about and talk about is the importance of, I think, language classes in helping with the musical world. And for me, English is my first language. And so English is 100% my background in that as a native English speaker. And in my experience, it's English classes that teach you how to read and write, and you learn how to interact with fiction and nonfiction work. But above all, what you learn are empathy and rhetoric. And I think that's the big thing that I'm able to bring into choral music, because those are two things that are core not just to interpreting music, but also to being able to create it from scratch, where language really is just this other dialect of music, where in a literature class, you're learning about themes, you're learning about structure, you're learning about figurative language. But all of these things that sometimes seem irrelevant are really what give you this ability to analyze, and you learn how to see something and not just be able to name that literary device, but then to go this extra step and understand the effect that it has. Where one of my favorite English teachers would say, so what? Yeah, you've named a literary device, but to what effect does that, like, who cares? And I think learning how to analyze and come up with your own interpretation of that in a literary sense or in the sense of a language classroom is a huge skill to be able to bring into the musical world, where that background in literary analysis, for me personally, greatly guides how I study and prep scores, but then also the conversations I have with ensembles that I'm conducting, where it's giving you this ability to think through the why behind musical structure, behind dynamics, behind motifs. Why does this thing repeat, and to what effect? Why should we be singing it again? But then also that idea that varying interpretations can exist and be valid. And a thing that matters a lot to me then with that background in a class like English is that when we're talking about artistic interpretation, it's not, oh, I have a perspective and I'm going to do that and I'm singing these words, but really that it is a musician's job to best represent what's already on the page. And I think that comes right back to that idea of literary analysis. And in my experience too, it's been that all of these language literacy skills pave the way for some of that representation to happen. But then all of it builds back to creating too, where it's all these skills we learn as these conveyors and interpreters of music that then allow us to be on this other side of music making, where we create music, of setting words to music. Whenever I'm setting someone else's words to music, a big part of my practice is looking at maybe a poem or a text and saying, okay, so what are they saying here? And how can I bring out what that meaning is? And I mean, incredible composers, Christopher Tin, Eric Whitacre, will talk about this process of learning how to extract the words of a poem. But in my experience, all of this in music making kind of is rooted in being able to understand and analyze the world around us. And that to me is a keystone of English and really liberal arts experience, where even it's in social sciences, where we learn and there's this mentality instilled of us of asking why, of digging for all these answers. And all of that makes us good music makers and makes us music makers that can authentically represent the music we're trying to convey.
Wow. Yes, there's so many aspects of what you just said that are directly related to some of my passions as well. I so strongly believe that as choral musicians, we can't just know music, or else we are scratching the surface. It's philosophy, it's language, it's rhetoric, as you mentioned, are huge, because what does a line of poetry even mean? Well, you don't have any qualification to interpret that poetry if you haven't studied rhetoric in some way. There is those aspects all intertwine, and you can't pull them apart. Now, I'm curious, you mentioned that, of course, that English is your first language. Have you had significant language training in any other specific languages? How would you describe that?
I mean, I'm someone I would describe myself as a jack of all trades, master of none. In that there are days I don't even know if my English is Englishing right. But I've grown up kind of surrounded by language in all sorts of various mediums. My mom is just this complete polyglot. She can speak like 10 languages, having grown up between India, Zambia, and then the UK. So I've grown up surrounded by language. But for me, I would say my mother tongue is Tamil. And so I've grown up speaking Tamil here and there at home. And that's a language that I feel very conversational in. And then I've grown up, learning English. And I would say it's the language I'm most proficient in. But then I've spent the past 7 or 8 years learning how to speak Spanish. And so my Spanish is incredibly conversational. The last choral convention I was at, I got to speak to a couple of native Spanish speakers and native Spanish presenters in their own language. And that was a language and medium in which I felt very comfortable, thanks to having had great teachers. And then I speak 3 or 4 other Indian languages with varying levels of proficiency, from being able to, order a taxi to asking for food and give me money, I'm lost. Yeah. But for me, I think it's just learning languages has been this big part of learning how to explore the world. And that definitely makes me a better choral musician, of it's learning just that there are all these idiosyncrasies to expression. And I think I'm very much an imperfect speaker of many languages, but that process of learning how to speak a language, it's just like learning how to read music, where it helps make so many connections, and it bolsters just that ability to think and explore and do it wrong and then keep trying to do it.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. And I'm glad you mentioned that also too. And that connection between language and music is a big priority of mine, to try to convince people that that's more related than you would think. I grew up, of course, learning to read music from my mother, who was a church musician, and she taught me to see the music in a hymnal in a church, in a Protestant church. But her approach was, just when I was super, super little, she would just point at the notes while everyone was singing. And I was actually learning it orally. Mm-hmm. There was no conversation, but I was also a pretty good natural language acquirer as a kid. Mm-hmm. So to me, no one could ever convince me that those two things are not related. I think it's related that I was a musician, but also that I picked up French from my cousins, just speaking conversationally, because that was their native language. Those are all oral things. And then those things helped me read later, if that makes sense. We wake up our ears and we start to listen for the nuances of the language, and I think that happens in music as well. Now, next thing I want to pick your brain about, because I've heard you mention it a few times already, and of course, being as young as you are, I just think this is fascinating. You've mentioned that you are having opportunities already to lead choirs. Where did that start? And how old were you when you got to be in charge of a choir for the first time?
Gosh, well, so this has all been pretty recent, but okay. I would, for as long as I've liked music, I would also be like, hey, to my friends, I need you to try and sing this thing. I think it would sound nice. And so for as long as I can remember, going back to elementary school, it's been me at a piano, kind of just doing my own thing and composing melodies and kind of acting very singer-songwriter. I thought for a long time that was my big passion, what I wanted to do, until I discovered choir and fell headfirst in love with making music with other people in that medium. And I've been arranging for choir since the 8th grade. And that just started with me wanting to do stuff and then realizing I really loved it, talking to choir teachers and mentors and saying, hey, I want to do this thing, and getting that mentorship where I needed it. So I'm super grateful to have had that very early. But then when it came to conducting itself, conducting was just a thing that I found myself really interested in, where I'd be, in rehearsal or even at an honor choir somewhere else. And I find it so fascinating that the angle of your hands changes the sound you get from a choir.
Yeah.
And that was a thing that fascinated me starting my freshman year when I started singing in a chamber choir for the first time. And I just seeking out opportunities, I found myself, with my hand raised all the time, asking not just what do you want us to do here? What dynamic do you want this? But also, how are you doing that thing? And that translated into just me doing my own research and all of this interest and passion that I had in my free time. And then finally in my sophomore year, I was super excited. I'd written this arrangement of I'll Be Home for Christmas that I really, really enjoyed writing and that I thought had merit to it. And so I went to my choir director and I was like, I want to perform this somewhere. And he was absolutely incredible and said, okay, great, find people to perform it with and I'll find you a place to do it. And so my first time conducting a choir happened by accident. I just wanted a group of people to sing my arrangement, but I needed to find a way to make that happen. And so I had 7 other friends who were incredibly gracious and willing to spend their time doing this thing with very little understanding of what I wanted out of them. And there I found myself having to kind of learn on the fly. And like, I want you to sing the right notes and I want to make it sound pretty. And I don't know how to do that. And so that was very much an experience of learning on the fly. And it kind of crashed and burned a little bit, but it also instilled in me the sense of how much I loved doing this thing, where I knew that I didn't have very many of the skills I wanted to have, but I also knew that I could do things. I could get people to sing the right harmony lines and I could get them to shape sounds in some of the ways I wanted. And that just instilled this love for me. And later that year, I had the ability to conduct a lab choir within my high school, and I fell in love with that even more. I had the ability to conduct a couple of my friends in several other chamber ensembles, and I just kept seeking it out. At that point, my PD was that I would go online. It was looking at videos of Robert Shaw conducting some of these choirs in live rehearsal and looking at some of those videos from the 90s that like super grainy and just listening for his voice. I'm like, okay, what's he doing? It turned into seeking out other choral series lectures by people like Rodney Eichenberger and Andre Thomas, the greats in the field, asking just for mentorship everywhere I could find it at these honor choirs of my own conductors, things like that. And it just snowballed. And I found myself doing all this stuff in my free time. I loved prepping scores. I loved planning rehearsals. And finally, then this, I guess 1 year ago this time, I found this opportunity, this advertisement actually by Dr. Barrett, Michael Barrett, on his Instagram when I was scrolling in bed, and it was for the European Choir Games in Denmark in 2025. And it seemed like the coolest thing ever. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need to go. And I have spent the past year finding a way to make that happen, from everything from finding people to grants to music to even writing music, because we didn't have enough repertoire that fit our group. And all of a sudden I ended up conducting a group at the European Choir Games, which was just such a cool life experience. But I don't know, I love it, and I've kept trying to find ways to make it happen.
Yeah, that's incredible. Now, is choral music or is music making a career goal for you? Or is this something you want to do as a passion project? Like how do you see this fitting into your life 10 years from now?
I'm still figuring that out, where I know I love music making. I can't imagine my life without doing this in some form, and specifically doing something choral, because I know I could sing for the rest of my life on my own. But the thing that gives this so much purpose and meaning for me is getting to do stuff with other people. And so I certainly see this fitting into my life. I'm still figuring out how. And so now it's a rising senior as I look at colleges and what life looks like after high school. A big priority for me is finding a place that I can study that has world-class music in addition to other things. I know I'm the best musician when my brain is also occupied doing incredibly analytical things across other realms, whether that's the social sciences, whether that's English. And so a big thing that I'm looking at right now, at least for the next 4 or 5 years, is how can I combine music with these other interests and get to have them all in my life? Because I'm the best musician, but I'm also the best student when I have each of the other things in my life.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What are some of those other, you say you're still figuring that out. So what are some of the other disciplines that you could see yourself doing? I'm just curious. Sorry if this is too personal.
No, not at all.
But so like say if it's music and X or music and XY, like how do you what other disciplines do you see in your collegiate years as like I've got to have those things?
Well, so I think the main things for me right now are music, some sort of a social science, and so more and more I think about policy, governance, pre-law, but then also English. And so for a long time for me it was, oh, I'm going to do this music stuff on the side. And then I woke up one morning realizing in the midst of actually working on this European Choir Games project that I was talking about, and I realized very seriously that I couldn't leave some sort of semi-professional music behind. This is a big part of who I am and what I love. And so a big thing that I've been looking at then is something in the realm of the social sciences and getting to have music. But then I had another one of those realizations when it came to English. I'm a great musician. When I am a great musician and when I have those moments, it's completely because of a background in social sciences and in English. And so to be the best musician I can be and to continue to strive in that realm, I know that I need to have not just the social sciences in my life, but English as well at a high level. And so more and more as I look at different universities and offerings and options, a big thing I'm looking at and asking is I'm like, could I triple major? Could I double major and minor? And find ways to keep all of these things and keep juggling them. But I don't know yet what that's going to look like.
Yeah. Well, advice you didn't ask for, which is that one of my biggest pet peeves, at least in American education, is we convince kids your age that if they have not figured out these things yet, that they're behind. And it's just not true. Like, you don't have to have this stuff figured out yet. It's okay to not know how all of these things are going to fit into your life. In fact, I would argue that that's normal. But yeah, so that's great. That's really, I'm glad that you're thinking through that already. Now, let's go in kind of one final direction in this conversation. I want to learn more about your experience at the World Choir Games. What was that like? I've never been. Of course, I've heard about it for years too, and I've never been a part of it, but I've always kind of seen it online, etc. So what was that like? What kind of group did you bring? Describe kind of the process. Is it like going to the Olympics? Like, what's going on there?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, in a nutshell, it was one of the coolest things I've ever done and think I ever will do. And I'm so insanely grateful for that experience. But like I said a couple minutes ago, about a year ago, I was, lying in bed scrolling Instagram over the summer as every high school rising junior does when you don't want to do your work. And as I was doing this, I came across a post from Dr. Michael Barrett, and I'd sung under him a couple years ago at one of these international honor choirs. And so I was in touch with him and I knew he was doing all this cool stuff. And he had this advertisement where he was just raving about this incredible experience called the European Choir Games. And immediately I was hooked. I went onto the website, and this is the whole choir game series is something run by the organization Interculture. And their whole mission is to bring community through music. And so they pitch themselves as being sort of a music festival and a music organization founded on Olympic ideals. And so it's that idea of high competition, but also world connection and getting to be at this crossroads with all sorts of other people who do the same things you do at a high level and who love it as much, if not more, as you do. And immediately I was hooked. So I spent the remainder of that summer doing research on this European Choir Games and what this incredible festival looked like. And very quickly that turned into looking at what a budget would look like, trying to see if I could get enough friends on board. And so it was kind of going into every single choir group chat I still had on my phone and texting people with no other context other than, would you like to travel to Denmark next summer to be part of this incredible choir festival and perform and compete? And it was just, it was a trip that came together against all odds, where very quickly I realized that the price tag for a trip like this was going to be north of 10 grand. US dollars, that is. So it was a $10,000 or more trip that seemed very quickly prohibitive.
Per singer?
In total.
In total. Okay, got it.
In total. Yep. And so that was for a choral trio. So to bring a group of 12 or more singers, it was looking like 20 or 30 or 40,000 US dollars, which felt completely prohibitive. But anyway, I spent that year then figuring out how to make this happen. And so I founded a choral trio. We ended up being just three of us. I found an alto and a baritone, and then myself as a soprano, who were willing to do this and give up a summer break to try and make this happen. We found ways to secure funding. So for the first time in my life, I learned how to write a grant proposal. And I submitted this grant proposal to multiple places. And finally, my high school was incredibly generous and ended up funding 70% of this trip, which made the trip possible. Then it was figuring out a successful audition where the European Choir Games required, in under 2 months, required us to submit at least 10 minutes of choral music that we performed. And so this group that I'd founded in under 2 weeks, all of a sudden had 3 or 4 more weeks to get this recording in. And so it was figuring out repertoire and figuring out what can we do in 2 weeks that's going to sound good enough that an incredible world organization is going to let us go sing as part of their festival. It then turned into figuring out how to get parent approval, where it was 3 of us trying to do this thing that kind of seemed like a boondoggle in the middle of Denmark. It sounded too good to be true. And then another hard thing was figuring out appropriate repertoire, where we were a 3-person unconducted a cappella youth or youth choral trio, which in itself is a mouthful. And so finding repertoire became really difficult. Repertoire that would be long enough to meet the requirements of the choir games panel, that would be appropriate for 3 adolescent voices who can't do everything and who have days where vocal folds don't connect. Finding repertoire that is doable without a conductor in front of you helping guide those cutoffs, that can be done very intuitively, and finding music that would still let us perform at this very high level. And then for me, it was also learning how to not just be a good liaison on the fly, whether that was travel logistics, figuring out how to budget this entire trip in a way that was not only fun, but also was able to get us there and do all of the bare minimum. And then learning how to be an artistic director, where I'd done lots of conducting, as I told you, but with training wheels, where I had a mentor to go running to and be like, help, they're not listening to me. They're not breathing. How do I get them to breathe? And for me, it was just a year of learning how to do things on the fly, where I think I spent every night either listening to some sort of PD that I could find, whether that was actually choralosophy or, the likes of Robert Shaw conducting online and that conducting 101, or it was maybe me standing in my bathroom conducting and looking at how can I create an environment where they're going to listen to me? Also, how can I be a good artistic director? How can I make this an environment that opens discussion and leaves room for us to have some of those interesting conversations as a trio? It was learning how to both be an artistic director and sing. It was learning how to prep scores, come up with repertoire that would all come together. And then finally, figuring out even repertoire that would be accepted, where we had submitted all our materials, we had paid for scores, submitted scores, we kind of had a very tight budget and figured everything out. And then the artistic committee from the European Choir Games got back to us saying, I'm sorry, your set's too short. And we had 2 weeks to send them everything, and we had no more money to pay for music. And so very last minute, I ended up writing our 4th piece that we performed. So it was all sorts of these curveballs. And finally, we got to 2 weeks before the competition. We had spent the entire year, pretty much every weekend, for at least 3 or 4 hours rehearsing. We were in a really good place. We were excited. And then the United Arab Emirates airspace is shut down because of international conflict. And so this was 48 hours before our trip. We were ready to go, and it seemed like we weren't going to be able to go, having been able to cross all of these hurdles. And finally, airspaces did open up, and we got to Denmark, and we had just this incredible, incredible experience. We had such a good time. We got to perform multiple times. We got to compete. We got to be part of all of these incredible workshops with world-class pioneers in the field. We ended up coming home with a silver diploma, which was huge. And we were actually the first group ever to represent our city, Abu Dhabi, or our country, the UAE, on the global choral competitive stage. So it was a big first to ever carry the flag for this incredible country we get to call our home, which was just incredible.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. Now, does the choir games have this is one of my curiosities from your story, I guess. Do they have a division do they have it like in different types of choirs? Because the first thing I'm thinking of is like it's apples and oranges to compare a trio to a choir of 70. Were you in a small ensemble type division? Is that how it worked?
So there were different categories. There were, I want to say, 10 categories off the top of my head. Everything from, adult choirs to youth choirs under 12 to youth choirs like us to musica sacra a cappella. And so there were various categories. The one we ended up fitting best in was youth choirs. And yet we were a choral trio. So we were by far the smallest ensemble there. I had to call 1 million people, and we got special permission to perform there as an ensemble of 3 because their normal minimum is 4 performers. And so we got there, and our competition within our category, the youth category, were choirs of 20 and 30 and 40 and 50. So it was very much like comparing apples and oranges, but it was also cool. We were the first choir of the kind, probably the smallest in the history of the competition. Certainly the first to compete under the UAE's flag. But then also getting to be in this room of world-class choirs. The biggest choir there was the Stellenbosch University Choir, and they were, I think, 101 singers. So there was this huge range.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So then The singers, the group that you have and that you created for this, was it really initially just like, I can only get 3 people to do it, so that's what it is? Or was it set out to be a trio? Like, how did that form?
That is exactly what it was. So my initial goal when planning this out was I had a whole set in the notes app called the Pipe Dream, and I had all these plans, and I was kind of figuring out how can I make this work logistically. And my aim was to have a chamber choir of 12. That had been the number that I worked with choirs of between 8 and 14 over the past year. And that seemed like a really good number where I could have three each of a voice part have an SATB choir. My plan initially was not to sing, just because the idea of having to direct a group but then also sing in it seemed insane and wildly impossible. Mm-hmm. And I kept putting these calls out, and I had all of these friends who were really excited, but there were just so many things to navigate. And at the end, it was me and 2 other singers. And I was lucky enough to find an incredible alto and an incredible baritone. And so I was like, okay, great. We have an SAB choral trio. And at this point, I think we were just all so deeply invested in this wild dream. And I wanted to find a way to make it happen, even if it was 3 of us singing on this world stage. So we set out to be a group of 12 or 14. We ended up being 3, and I wouldn't have had it any other way.
That's awesome. Now, after the games are done now, do you plan to still sing together? Is this a thing that you're continuing to do, or was it just really for that event and then it's done?
You know what? Unfortunately not. Where we created this, over the year I think, created this incredible sacred space as a trio. But one of the sad parts about living in a place as wonderful as the UAE is it's this incredible international port of sorts where people come and go. And the baritone was a senior who has since moved to Canada for college. And my dear friend just moved away to Saudi Arabia. And so I think we've created a really special thing. And I think the nature of being in the UAE too is that such groups and such experiences are in some ways ephemeral because of the nature of just the many different lives the people who live in the UAE lead. So I think this is probably the European Choir Games was probably the last we sung together, which is very fitting, I think, for having been a group to get to represent a host country like the UAE.
Yeah. Now, and maybe kind of before we wrap this up and before we sign off, I've seen some of your stuff on your Instagram. You created so people who are trying to visualize and try to picture how this group of 3 high school students would have gone off to do this. There are ways that they can see that. Could you tell us where we could find little snippets of your experience?
Absolutely, yeah. So the majority of everything we have online is on our Instagram page, ARA Abu Dhabi. So ARA_ABUDHABI. And to tell you a little bit about the name of our trio, so we are called ARA, and ARA is a word that is representative of each of our names, Ananya, Robin, and Ashley. That is the 3 of us who were the part of the trio. But it's also a word in Arabic that means I see. And so Ana Ara is to say I see in Arabic, which we thought was incredibly representative of what we were trying to do and this beautiful gift of music that we have, where through music we have this insight like no other. And through music, getting to do music the way we do as international students living in Abu Dhabi, we have this incredible gift of having grown up with so much intercultural music, and also having this gift of insight that we get to provide our audiences, getting to sing music from all over the globe, getting to share experiences that not everyone has. And so that was a big thing that mattered to us. But yeah, we can be found on Instagram as Ara Abu Dhabi.
That's amazing. Well, Ananya, thank you so much for sharing your experience. This has been not only interesting, but also very impressive. So keep doing what you're doing, and I hope you figure out how music will continue to be a part of your life. It sounds like you're off to an incredible start. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. 1, use the promo code. That's the biggest one. At Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choralosophy checkout code. And of course, now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.